Now, let me just talk about the question of Sudanese oil for a minute. Everyone worries about the 2/3 that are being purchased by the Chinese. No one asks the moral questions about the 1/3 purchased by European concerns, for instance. But of those, as it were, oil assets from Sudan, that's not, for the most part, they are not, for the most part, going to China to service the Chinese industrial machine at this moment in time. The Chinese sell most of it on the Amsterdam spot market. What the oil wars in Africa are all about is not about immediate benefit for China, but for future benefit, when the industrial machine in China has grown to the extent when they really do need to have, as it were, all of these energy resources. The Chinese projection is precisely for that moment in time to coincide with that moment in time in the United States when Middle East oil is no longer enough. So everyone is looking 20 years down the line. And a very great deal of the very, very significant and visible sweeteners that the Chinese put into their development model are really for prospecting rights that might deliver nothing upstream. Now, where it concerns the theme of this conference is that a very great deal of the prospecting, a very great deal of the civil engineering infrastructural projects that get put in up front have got ecological damage. These are very, very much projects to facilitate certain forms of political and economic opportunities for the future, and not necessarily to safeguard the environment either in the future or now. But what the Chinese have done is to have established a model of investment and a model of developmental support which has made, to a very large extent, the Western model not redundant, but a model that has come underneath very serious threat. What you get with the Chinese is a huge sweetener package up front, give us prospecting rights and you get all of this. It comes immediately, it comes without conditionality, neither political conditionality nor onerous economic conditionality. It comes, and there are benefits and disadvantages with this, as a ready-made package. You want a road, Chinese engineers come down, Chinese workers come down. Everything is done by the Chinese, you get your road. Then everyone goes home. You get the road, but you get no transfer of technological benefit by way of education and development of local workers. You get no, as it were, added value from the Chinese investment or the Chinese gift or the Chinese benefaction, except the road. All of the things that you would want to have by way of developing your own civil engineering capacities in your own developing country to further your own long-term developmental goals, that's left out of the equation. But you get your road, and you get it a lot faster than with, say, World Bank support or going through all of the very cumbersome and conditionality-ridden American favored and Western-favored models of development. Now, people have been talking about the dangers of the Chinese way of doing things. And what I wanted to say is it's no longer going to be the Chinese way of doing things. When you look at a very, very tentative, speculative, but very much to test out the waters bid by Russia to tie up all kinds of petroleum futures in Nigeria 2 years ago, it was modeled almost entirely along the Chinese lines, what I call the Shanghai School of Development Economics. When you look at a recent bid about 18 months ago by Mittal Steel with the support of the Indian government, again for industrial concessions in Nigeria, it was modeled almost entirely along the schools of the Shanghai, along the lines of the Shanghai School. If you look down at so-called lesser players, but emerging players like Malaysia, like Indonesia, there's a whole raft of actors internationally who are experimenting with variations of the Chinese model of development assistance. So that Africa does become, in the eyes of many people, not just the United States and not just in the eyes of the Chinese, very, very much a continent of very, very great opportunity for the future, particularly by way of resource expropriation. But not only that, there are all kinds of things that I think we don't look at because we're so focused on the short term. What do the Chinese want to do in the long term with Africa? So this turns to the second, more speculative part of what I wanted to say to you today. And because it's speculative, I'll say it briefly because there's no evidence for this. It's very, very much a speculation. But if you work on the basis that Chinese industrial output is slowly going to go, as it were, upmarket, you don't stay very much at the level of providing goods for Xinjiang shops forever. And you can see some evidence of that already in the high streets. Any of you young people here who are wearing clothes from H&M will know instantly that all of these things are made in China. That's the lower end of the market, but rendered in some pastiche of what is meant to be fashionable right now. All of you who have made it to your first major promotion and who are wearing clothes from Armani Exchange, and you're finally wearing the lower end of a fashion mark, they're made in China too. So what you've got is a steady escalation of Chinese production quality, very much designed to move up the market. Now, as this starts to happen, Africa will become less and less of a market for Chinese exports. It becomes very, very much a target, of course, for Chinese resource extraction. But in terms of Africa's use as a market to the Chinese, I think in relative terms that's going to decline. But if Chinese industry is going to start moving towards more upmarket productivity, the outsourcing of lower-end market productivity could quite easily go to Africa. Not necessarily in the clothing industry, but certainly in things that we, again in the West, are falling very far behind in terms of our ability to anticipate. Watch for automobiles in the future. There's a very, very large automobile firm in China, Brilliant Automobiles, a wonderful name, exploring actively now cooperation with the South African car industry. Any of you who aspire to drive or who are driving a BMW, almost certainly that car was assembled in South Africa. All of you who are very, very, as it were, concerned to have upmarket latest generation catalytic converters in your cars, they're made in South Africa. The new generation of particulate filters, which will be even more effective than catalytic converters, are likely also to be made in South Africa, if for no other reason than they have a monopoly of the world's major exploitable platinum deposits. The Chinese are canny enough to realize that there are certain parts of Africa where all kinds of cooperations could be possible, and other parts of Africa where other kinds of cooperation might be possible by way of outsourcing cheaper forms of production for lower ends of the market. In other words, what you've got is not only something which is a concern for the present, and you can see that very, very much in Washington, but certain concerns, I think, for the future in terms of the competitiveness of the West. And some of these things have, as I said, all kinds of environmental hazards and consequences. Let me say a final thing about a certain attractiveness about what the Chinese are trying to do in Africa. What they're able to say is that they never colonized Africa. Not only that, but they themselves were the subjects of colonial efforts, of imperial outreach. They themselves only achieved their liberation in the 20th century, as African states, for the most part, did. And they themselves have been active in supporting African liberation movements. Their bona fides come impeccably until very, very recent times, when not so much Chinese state or party or major corporation-led investment began raising eyebrows, but very much the behavior, and you have to describe this frankly as racist, on the part of so-called independent Chinese entrepreneurs who began setting up shop in Africa, not only in the retail sector, but in the mining sector. It became a major election issue in Zambia, for instance, 2 elections ago. Now, what you've got, therefore, is a very, very strange phenomenon of a developing Chinese diaspora in many African countries that is not integrated in any significant way with the local habits and the local customs and the local outlooks of African populations.